Hi everyone, my name is Danielle Gatti Palumbo. I'm a clinical pharmacist at Northwell Health Division of Rheumatology in Long Island, New York. And today I'll be presenting on the journal update on the efficacy and safety profile of voclosporin, an integrated analysis of clinical trials in lupus nephritis, which was published in 2023 Arthritis Care and Research. So voclosporin is a novel calcineurin inhibitor that does not need therapeutic drug monitoring as other calcineurin inhibitors do. In the AURA-1 and AURA-LV trials, they emphasized the approval of voclosporin as being a safe and low-maintenance therapeutic regimen that limits steroid exposure, as well as meeting the optimal therapeutic outcomes. So these studies make up the largest successful lupus nephritis clinical program to date, with the most amount of patients in total of 534 patients. And as you know, with lupus nephritis trials, finding that patient load is pretty hard because of the many caveats to enrollment. The objective of this study was to combine the data with both of those studies into a more integrated analysis to obtain a larger ethnically and racially diverse patient population, allowing for a more in-depth analysis of the safety as well as the efficacy outcomes in specific subpopulations. So the trial design was taking the data from both of these studies, the phase 2 studies, which were both randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blinded, multi-center international studies. And the patients were included in the study if they were adult patients of 18 years or older diagnosed with active lupus nephritis via kidney biopsy, class 3, 4, and 5 with mixed within 6 months for the AURA-LV trial via biopsy, or 2 years of enrollment with via biopsy for AURA-1 trial. They also had to have a proteinuria of more than or equal to 1.5 milligrams or 2 milligrams per milligram of class 5 by first morning void. They needed to have an eGFR of greater than 45 milliliters per minute. At screening, they needed to require immunosuppression therapy, and patients were allowed to be on ACEs or ARBs, but they just couldn't have any new initiation or dosage modifications 4 weeks prior to randomization. They did exclude patients with QT prolongation and those with an eGFR of less than 45 milliliters per minute. So for the AURA-LV trial, patients were randomized to receive 2 different dosings of voclosporin with 2 different placebo arms matching the voclosporin dosing. The AURORA-1 trial, patients were randomized to either receive 1-to-1 voclosporin 23.7 milligrams twice a day or matching placebo as a control arm. And all patients received background mycophenolate at 2 grams per day, but a range of 1 to 3 grams per day was allotted, as well as glucocorticoids, and the glucocorticoids were administered according to a protocol-defined tapering schedule. The endpoints for this study, the primary endpoint being the complete renal response at year 1 of treatment, combining the AURA-LV data at 48 weeks with AURORA-1 data at 52 weeks. And the complete renal response was defined as having a urine protein creatinine ratio of less than or equal to 0.5 milligrams with an eGFR of greater than 60 mLs per minute and no decrease from baseline more than 20%, no administration of rescue medications, no more than 10 milligrams of prednisone equivalent per day from 3 or more consecutive days or 7 or more days during an 8-week period before efficacy assessment. The secondary endpoints included complete renal response at 6 months, partial renal response, which was defined as more than 50% reduction from baseline in urine protein creatinine ratio at 1 year and 6 months, time to reaching that UPCR of less than 0.5 milligrams, and the time to reaching the 50% or more greater reduction in the UPCR from baseline. Statistical analysis was performed using all the pooled data from the 23.7 milligram twice a day voclosporin dosing arm and all control arms of the AURORA-1. Efficacy analysis included all patients. Safety analysis included all patients that received at least 1 dose. And the results of this involved 534 patients in total. The mean age was around 33. Women were majority, the equal proportions of white and Asians, And in this analysis, there was 10% of the population was Black, 25% was Hispanic and Latino, which does correlate mostly with our lupus nephritis and lupus patients. ACEs and ARBs and antimalarials were similar in both groups. And lupus nephritis diagnosis was found to be more recent in the AURA-LV study by 0.9 years versus 2 years in the AURORA study. So demographics were similar. There was a higher proportion of Hispanic and Latino patients enrolled in the AURORA-1 than the AURA-LV, and a higher proportion of Asian patients that were enrolled in the AURA-LV than the AURORA. So combining those, this is giving us a better sense of a diverse patient population. So including that 10% Black patient population and 25% Hispanic and Latino. So the results from this study found that there was a higher proportion of patients in the Voclosporin group that achieved a complete renal response at 1 year, and also voclosporin treatment was associated with a statistically significantly higher achieving complete renal response at 6 months. The complete renal response rates were numerically greater in voclosporin regardless of all ages, races, regions, ethnicities, biopsy classes, as well as eGFR and UPCR levels at baseline. There was a significantly higher proportion in the voclosporin group that achieved partial renal response at 1 year as well as 6 months. And importantly, there was more than 50% reduction in the urine protein creatinine ratio from baseline at the time was achieved in 93.7% of those in the voclosporin group versus 75.2% in those in the control group. And one of the main things with voclosporin that we find and like is that it is fast acting. So the median time to achieving a 50% reduction in the urine protein creatinine ratio was 29 days in voclosporin versus 58 days in the control group. And this was specifically significant in those with lupus nephritis class 3 and 4 compared to the respective controls. And this short time frame was also seen in those with class 5. However, it wasn't statistically significant. But that is something that we kind of highlight with voclosporin is that it does achieve that reduction in the protein creatinine ratio pretty significantly fast. Adverse reactions, the adverse profile for voclosporin was kind of similar in both groups. The most common treatment-related infections with voclosporin and the control groups were herpes zoster, UTI, and URIs. There was 4 malignancies that were reported in the voclosporin group. There were 17 deaths that were found to be unrelated to treatment. And due to the hemodynamic effects of calcineurin inhibitors, they found that there was a change in the eGFR and some needed dose adjustments. Hypertension, of course, was also found to be more common in voclosporin, and the mean glucose and hemoglobin A1C levels were stable in both groups, but they did find that triglycerides and LDL were reduced at 1 year in the voclosporin group. So from this, the authors found that voclosporin produced a favorable result with an increase in complete renal response of more than 20% and a reduction in proteinuria within the first 6 months of therapy, and statistically significant results regarding efficacy in new disease as well as severe disease. Patients in both trials produced statistically significant complete renal response in the absence of needing a high-dose steroid, so meaning that maybe they don't really need steroids to achieve this remission. And the safety profile was basically comparable with no statistical significance to the control group, especially in calcineurin attributed side effects that we would have expected. Lipid profiles also improved with voclosporin treated patients, along with stable mean blood pressures, glucose, and electrolytes. So previous studies were not as racially diverse and mostly focused on young, white, and also Asian females. This study did incorporate and was able to extract that data and incorporate a more diverse patient population. So regarding races, it has 10% of Black and also 25% Hispanic and Latino, while we find that non-white race or African American, Hispanic, and Asians also is associated with a more severe presentation and also greater organ damage in lupus and lupus nephritis. So that's why this was pretty significant that these results can be extrapolated to the different races and what we see in our patient population. It's also important to point out that the AURORA-2 was released and is a continuation of the AURORA-1 study, which included 216 patients who transitioned from AURORA-1 to AURORA-2. And this is a more in-depth of a longer follow-up of 3 years of total duration with voclosporin, indicating this long-term safety and efficacy of voclosporin over 3 years. More than 80% of patients who completed AURORA-1 went on to AURORA-2, but the number of Black as well as class 5 disease patient population in these studies also does still remain on the lower end. Also considering the new lupus guidelines, especially for lupus nephritis guidelines, they prefer first-line therapy especially for class 5 lupus nephritis, triple therapy, and they do support the use of calcineurin inhibitors, specifically voclosporin plus mycophenolate and low-dose steroids to achieve earlier reductions in the proteinuria in patients with significant class 5 lupus nephritis or proliferative lupus nephritis. So again, highlighting that voclosporin does do that reduction in the urine protein creatinine ratio quicker. In this study, it found that it was 29 days versus 58 days versus the control. So this was pretty significant and is probably what we want to achieve in our patients that have very proliferative disease. But the number of Black and class 5 disease patient population in these studies still remains on the lower end. So with that, there's also the new lupus nephritis guidelines, which have come out and prefer first-line therapy for class 5 lupus nephritis with triple therapy, which includes steroids, mycophenolate, and can also include calcineurin inhibitors such as voclosporin. And this is to help achieve an earlier reduction in proteinuria in patients with class 5 lupus nephritis or proliferative disease. And this is because in our studies, voclosporin had achieved more than 50% reduction in the proteinuria from baseline at 29 days versus 58 days in the control group. So also achieving a higher complete renal response in lupus nephritis patients with proteinuria, even in patients that had more than 2 grams per day compared to the control group. So really with the newer guidelines coming out, we may start to see more use of voclosporin, especially in those with proliferative disease, and achieving that drastic, quick response in proteinuria. So for more information on voclosporin as well as lupus and lupus nephritis, please visit our website at rap.org and click on the content room page. Thank you.